Chapter 16, Solid and Hazardous Waste. So after having talked about air pollution and water pollution in chapters 9 and 10, we're going to jump way ahead and we're actually going to talk about solid waste pollution. So that's kind of what chapter 16 is about. We'll go back then and cover some of the chapters that we missed, but I like to put all of the pollution chapters together so we can kind of talk about the threats to, again, air, water, and ground all at the same time. So in this quick 10-minute overview, we're going to talk about what is solid waste, how we can reduce solid waste, and then we'll discuss a little bit about hazardous waste and how to manage it. So solid waste is simply products, things that we cannot use that we get rid of. And essentially in the United States, we generate more solid waste per person than any other country. In general, we throw away about a little over 2 kilograms per day of stuff. Now, not everything we throw away is necessarily considered waste. Some of the things that we throw away can be recycled. Some of the things we throw away could be repaired or reused, and that's especially true in other countries where they don't have as many goods as we have. But because we come from a country where we have a fairly disposable economy, it simply means we use something once and we tend to throw it away. We tend to generate a lot of waste. So, for example, plastic bottles is a really good example of some of the waste that we often produce. Solid waste comes in two varieties, what we call municipal solid waste and then non-municipal solid waste. Municipal solid waste is all of the waste combined from residential and commercial waste. So waste that the stores produce and medical offices and, well, not necessarily medical offices, we'll get to them in a minute, but residences, normal office complexes, businesses, schools, you name it. Those are the types of places that we have this municipal solid waste coming from. It's mostly paper and paperboard, plastics, metals, rubbers, leathers, wood, glass, those types of things. Non-municipal solid waste is the other piece of the waste puzzle, and this is what is generated by industry, agriculture, and mining. So if you think of manufacturing process, what's left over at the end after we have gone through and grown our food, what do we do with those crop residues, and also, of course, mining. Mining creates a huge amount of waste. So again, here's all of the solid waste that we produce. And I mentioned mining creates a huge amount of waste. It creates the most waste of anything. 76% of all waste is created by the mining industry. There's agriculture, that is industry, and here's municipal solid waste. It only makes up about 1.5% of all solid wastes. And of that, most of it is paper and paperboard products. So what do we do with it? We used to just throw it in a hole in the ground. It was called an open dump. Can't do that anymore. They are unsanitary, smelly. They cause disease-carrying animals. They've been outlawed. Now we use what are called sanitary landfills. What we basically have to do is we have to bury our waste now, whereas before we didn't have to. So you can put it in a landfill, you can burn it, or you can compost it. So most of what we do is we discard our waste in landfills. Okay, the rest is recycling and then incineration. So what makes a landfill, sanitary versus unsanitary? What they are is that they have been carefully designed so that we don't pollute local groundwater. So we put liners in the bottom of these holes and we cover it with dirt as each new layer is put on. Here's a nice picture from your textbook that shows you kind of what this looks like. So we've got all these liners in place to prevent water that comes through and drains through all of this trash. It prevents it from picking up hazardous chemicals and dumping them into groundwater, for example. So that's what we call a sanitary landfill. If we don't bury it, we burn it. Pros of burning: you reduce the volume of waste by 90%. You can produce heat and electricity, which are, two bonuses. The best things to burn are paper, plastic, and rubber. Downside, lots of air pollution. So particularly carbon monoxide, heavy metals, and toxic materials. So incineration is sometimes an option, sometimes not. It's kind of expensive to do because of all of the air pollution control methods that you have to have in place in order to be able to actually have a commercial incinerator. Last but not least is composting. Composting is really limited to food scraps. You also have sewage sludge and agricultural manure if you had that, but mostly it's food scraps. There are some commercial composting operations, but more often than not, you have people who just do it in their backyards. A backyard composter, you throw some plant material in there, some leaves, for example, and some branches, and then you throw your food scraps in there. All you need is a container for it, essentially, and bacteria do the rest. So our next big point we're going to talk about is how to reduce our solid waste. So we have all of this waste, and we can either throw it away or recycle it or burn it, basically. But really what we should be looking at is how do we prevent the waste in the first place? So I mentioned that we live in kind of a disposable economy, this idea that we can buy something once, we use it and throw it away. To change things, to really reduce the amount of waste that we're producing, we really need to take it all the way back to the beginning and ask ourselves, do I really need to buy this at all? And if I do buy something, is it something that I'm going to get a lot of use out of continually, or is it a disposable item that I'm going to use once and then I'm going to throw it away? So we also can look at source reduction. So this is where manufacturers are being challenged to actually find ways to produce their goods without producing large amounts of solid and hazardous waste. So back to that discussion question we had about, should we make the cost of pollution sort of part of the process when we cost out these items? If more manufacturers did this, if more of them looked at ways to reduce how much waste they produce and how much pollution they reduced, it would go a long way. And that's termed source reduction. Again, this is what the manufacturers themselves do. And then, of course, we can talk just about how can we do creative reuse? What can we do with those products? The next big idea when reducing solid waste is recycling materials. Even though recycling makes up a fair amount of that percentage of the pie, about 33% of materials were being recycled, there's really a whole lot more we can do when it comes to recycling. The great benefits of recycling is it conserves our natural resources. If we can use post-consumer materials, that's a fancy word to say recycled materials. So if you ever buy something and it says, this package was made with 30% post-consumer materials, what that means is 30% of the bag is made up of recycled goods, is what it means. So we can save water. We can save energy. We can save an awful lot of things if we recycle. So what we're looking at is how much of a product was actually recycled, and then how much of not a product, but of a category here was disposed of in landfills. And each bar corresponds to a different decade. And essentially what it's showing you is even though we're doing a fairly good job of recycling some things, paper and paperboard, even yard trimmings, there's an awful lot of things that we could do a lot better. Plastics in particular, glass, there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to recycling. Integrated waste management, is a concept real quickly that just talks about how we can effectively manage our waste problem. What we can do, this whole idea of the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, looking at source reduction. So it's a combination of all of these different strategies, increasing composting, those types of things, in order to minimize the amount of waste that we're actually putting into landfills or having to burn. Lastly, I want to talk about hazard waste. You also might call it toxic waste. It's a very small part of the U.S. waste stream. It's only about 1%. And mostly these are things that if they were discarded in a normal way, that they could threaten our health or the environment. So these things that they're reactive, they're corrosive, they're toxic, they're ignitable. They can be solids or liquids or gases. There's about 700,000 different chemicals that fall into this category. And one of the reasons why we actually care now about how toxic waste is dumped is years ago, 40, 50 years ago, there was no special designation for toxic waste. You dumped it, and wherever you dumped it, you dumped it. It didn't really matter. Unfortunately, one of those times is a chemical company dumped a bunch of toxic waste, covered the land up with some soil, and they donated it to their local school board. You said, here's some free land. We don't need it anymore. We're leaving the site, so you guys go ahead and use it for whatever you want it for. Well, as it turns out, all that toxic waste that they dumped leaked out into the neighborhood, and it began to contaminate homes and drinking water, and it was a really big mess. What it did is it helped us create what's called the Superfund Act. And the Superfund Act is what we use. It's also called the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA. You might hear it called CERCLA also. What it says is, look, we the government are not going to be always stuck footing the bill for cleaning up what private companies did. So what it establishes is that any abandoned hazardous waste site, the cleanup responsibility is the company who dumped all of the waste. So you have to pay for the cleanup. That's kind of the idea. And it could be anything from just old barrels that are corroding to, again, sort of these larger chemical storage tanks, you name it. There's a whole host of different toxic materials that had been stored either above ground or even underground that have become a priority as far as cleanup goes. The proper way to handle hazardous waste is put it into long-term storage, and that's what these toxic waste landfills are. And these toxic waste landfills are basically a place where you would take those same barrels that we just saw kind of corroding above the surface, and you would bury them deep, 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 deep underground, and you would use a whole host of concrete and different types of barriers to prevent any leaks that potentially happened from getting anywhere into the soil or groundwater contamination. That's the idea. So that's all for this particular chapter. Please make sure you go back and read through the rest of the notes. It talks a little bit more about categories of hazardous waste, for example, and also a few more points about recycling. So please make sure you do review those notes throughout this chapter.